Number 1. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. There is a particular kind of terror that comes not from the darkness of strangers, but from the face you recognize at Sunday service, the voice you hear reading scripture from the pulpit, the man who measures your lawn with a ruler and leaves a citation on your door for being 2 inches over the municipal limit. Dennis Lynn Rader was that man. He was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the eldest child of a working-class family in the American heartland. By all external measures, his upbringing followed the predictable rhythms of post-war Midwestern life. A devout Lutheran household, a structured home, the kind of childhood that produces men who coach Little League and attend city council meetings and are remembered at their funerals as pillars of the community. Rader himself grew into exactly that kind of man, or so the world believed for 31 years. He attended Wichita Heights High School, where he was photographed in the 1962 yearbook as an unremarkable teenager, and he went on to serve in the United States Air Force, completing his military obligation and returning to civilian life with the kind of background that commands quiet respect in small American communities. He later studied at Wichita State University and worked his way through a series of jobs that placed him, consistently and deliberately, in positions of authority over others, positions that allowed him to enter homes, observe households, and move through neighborhoods with a legitimacy that no one questioned. 4 years he worked at ADT Security, a home security company, where his job was literally to walk through people's private spaces and assess how vulnerable they were to outside intrusion. The irony of that employment was lost on everyone around him until it was far too late. In 1991, he transitioned to a position as compliance supervisor for the Wichita suburb of Park City, where he quickly became known as the most zealous enforcer of municipal codes in the area. Neighbors recalled him arriving with a measuring tape to check the height of their grass. He pursued stray animals through the streets with a tranquilizer gun. He issued citations with what multiple witnesses described as an obvious pleasure in the exercise of his limited authority. A man who derived something from the act of control that went beyond any professional duty. He was also, during this same period, a Boy Scout troop leader, a role that placed him in mentorship over the very demographic of children and families who trusted him most completely. And at the center of all of this, the job, the civic duty, the community leadership, was his church. Rader was not merely a member of Christ Lutheran Church in the Park City suburb of Wichita. He was the president of the Congregation Council. He led worship. He was the person families turned to in times of grief and uncertainty. His wife, Paula, whom he had met at that very same church and married in 1971, believed she was married to a decent man. His 2 children grew up in a household that appeared, to every observable measure, to be exactly what it claimed to be. Carrie Rawson, his daughter, would later describe her father as warm and present, a man who took the family camping, who attended her school events, who seemed to her, across her entire childhood and into her adult life, like a genuinely loving parent. She learned the truth about who her father was in the same moment the rest of the world did, and the shock of that revelation shaped the rest of her life in ways she has spent decades trying to articulate. What Dennis Rader was doing during all those years of church leadership and compliance citations and Boy Scout meetings was something that the people closest to him could not have imagined and would not have believed if told. Beginning in January 1974, Rader engaged in a pattern of targeted violence against residents of the Wichita area that he himself described, in letters he eventually sent to law enforcement and local media, using an acronym he coined himself, BTK, standing for Bind, Torture, Kill. The first attack occurred on January 15, 1974, and it was among the most devastating in terms of the number of lives affected in a single episode. The Otero family, Joseph Otero, his wife Julie, and 2 of their children, 9-year-old Joseph Jr. and 11-year-old Josephine, were targeted inside their own home at 803 North Edgemore Street in Wichita while their older children were away at school. Rader had surveilled the house in advance, selecting the family after observing their daily routines from the outside. He entered the residence that January morning and, over the course of the hours that followed, caused the deaths of all 4 family members. The older Otero children returned home from school that afternoon to discover a scene that would define the rest of their lives. Rader later described this attack in disturbingly clinical language during his 2005 guilty plea proceedings, recounting it with the flat, procedural tone of someone reading from a checklist rather than acknowledging the immensity of what he had done. He told the court that he experienced what he called a compulsion that had been building inside him for years, a dark internal pressure that he had attempted to manage through what he referred to as a fantasy life, and that the Otero family had been selected not because of anything personal but because they had simply entered his field of observation at the wrong moment. This explanation, offered without visible remorse in a Wichita courtroom 3 decades after the fact, stunned the families of victims who had spent those 30 years without answers. In the years that followed the Otero family, Rader continued his pattern of targeted harm while maintaining every outward aspect of his normal life. In April 1974, just 3 months after the Otero attack, he targeted Catherine Bright, 21 years old, at her home on East 13th Street in Wichita. Her brother Kevin was also present and was injured during the encounter but survived, and it was Kevin Bright who would later appear at Rader's sentencing hearing to confront the man responsible for his sister's death and his own lifelong trauma. Rader's subsequent victims included Shirley Vian in March 1977, a mother of 3 whose children Rader locked in a bathroom during the attack, and Nancy Fox in December 1977, a 25-year-old woman whose death Rader announced to authorities himself, calling the Wichita police from a pay phone and telling them where to find her before calmly returning to his life. That phone call, made in December 1977, illustrated something that investigators would later identify as one of the most psychologically distinctive elements of the BTK case: Rader's compulsive need for recognition. He did not want to simply commit these acts and disappear. He wanted the world to know that he had done them, and he wanted the world to know that they could not catch him. He wanted to be known. This need drove him to communicate repeatedly with law enforcement and local media over the years, sending letters, packages, and coded messages that identified him only by the nickname he had given himself. In one letter, he complained to Wichita media that his crimes were not receiving enough coverage. In another, he proposed the BTK name himself, as though he were branding a project rather than acknowledging the taking of human lives. These communications served as the only thread connecting investigators to the person responsible, because in every other respect Rader was invisible. The Wichita community lived in fear of BTK for years, changing their habits, installing additional locks, watching their neighbors with new suspicion. And the man responsible was attending their church, leading their children's scout meetings, and issuing them citations for parking violations. Following the death of Nancy Fox in December 1977, something shifted. Rader went silent. The BTK letters stopped. The pattern of targeted harm ceased. Law enforcement investigators, who had been building a task force around the case, eventually reached a point where the leads had dried up and the case, while never formally closed, had effectively stalled. Rader himself has stated, in later interviews conducted after his arrest, that he substituted his compulsion during this dormant period with other behaviors, and that he continued to fantasize but did not act. He was, during these quiet years, the compliance officer with the tranquilizer gun, the church council president, the scout leader, the ordinary man next door. He went on family vacations. He helped his children with their homework. He attended services and shook hands with neighbors after the sermon. Then, in 2004, 30 years after the Otero family and 13 years after his last confirmed act of harm, the BTK letters began again. A letter arrived at a Wichita television station in March 2004. Then another. Then packages containing items connected to the original crimes. Rader had re-emerged, and the fear that had defined Wichita in the 1970s came flooding back. A renewed task force was assembled. Investigators worked to identify the source of the communications. Rader, emboldened by decades of evasion and apparently convinced that he was still untouchable, made a decision that would end his freedom. He communicated with law enforcement through a local classified advertisement to ask whether a computer disk he intended to send them could be traced back to him. Investigators, through the classified ad, indicated that it could not. Rader believed them. He sent a floppy disk. It was the last mistake he would ever make as a free man. Forensic technicians examined the disk and found metadata embedded in a Microsoft Word document saved on it. The document had last been edited at Christ Lutheran Church. The author listed in the file properties was a man named Dennis. Police cross-referenced this with their known information about the church. They conducted surveillance. They collected a DNA sample from a Pap smear test taken by Rader's daughter Carrie during a routine medical examination, obtained through a court order without Carrie's knowledge, and compared it to biological material recovered from one of the original crime scenes. The match was confirmed. Dennis Lynn Rader, compliance officer, Boy Scout leader, and president of Christ Lutheran Church, was the BTK killer. He was arrested on February 25, 2005, pulled over in his own neighborhood by law enforcement officers who approached his vehicle calmly, so as not to alert him to the scale of what was about to happen. He was taken into custody without incident. His wife Paula, his daughter Carrie, and his son Brian learned the truth in the hours that followed, a truth that dismantled every memory they possessed of the man they had believed him to be. Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder. In June 2005, in a Sedgwick County courtroom, he pleaded guilty to all 10 counts. The guilty plea proceedings became one of the most disturbing courtroom moments in the history of American criminal justice, not because of outburst or drama, but because of their absence. Rader stood at the podium and described each of his 10 victims in sequential order, using clinical language and an almost administrative tone, walking through the timeline of each act with the detachment of someone presenting a quarterly report. Families of victims who had waited 30 years for answers sat in that courtroom and heard the man who destroyed their lives describe those events as though they were items on an agenda. Judge Gregory Waller, who presided over the sentencing hearing on August 18, 2005, described the proceedings as among the most difficult of his judicial career. Victim family members addressed the court one by one. Fred Fox, whose sister Nancy Fox was among the 10 victims, told the court that the man before him had taken something that could never be replaced. Kevin Bright, who had survived his encounter with Rader in 1977 and watched his sister Catherine die, told the court that his sister had suffered deeply and that he had spent his life carrying the weight of what happened on that April morning. Beverly Plapp, another sister of Nancy Fox, delivered remarks so raw and direct that they have been quoted in coverage of the case ever since. Judge Waller sentenced Dennis Rader to 10 consecutive life sentences, the maximum available under Kansas law, which had no death penalty at the time the crimes were committed. The minimum time Rader must serve before any possibility of parole consideration is 175 years, meaning he will die in prison. He is currently housed at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he remains as of 2026, now 81 years old. His daughter Carrie Rawson has written a memoir about her experience and has spoken publicly about the process of rebuilding her identity after discovering that the father she loved was the man the rest of the world feared. His wife Paula filed for divorce immediately following his arrest. The church where he led worship, where neighbors confided in him and families sought his guidance, quietly removed any trace of his leadership from their records. What the BTK case left behind, beyond the grief of 10 families and the trauma of an entire community, was a question that criminologists and psychologists have continued to grapple with ever since. Not how a person could commit such acts, but how a person could commit them and then stand in front of a congregation the following Sunday morning and mean every word of the opening prayer. Number 2. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. There are men who build things and men who destroy things, and the most disturbing cases in criminal history belong to those in whom both impulses existed simultaneously, expressed in perfect compartments that never seemed to touch. John Wayne Gacy was a builder by profession. He ran a successful construction company in the suburbs of Chicago, managed a team of workers, won contracts from local businesses and homeowners, and was known in his community as a man who got things done. He was also a man who dressed as a clown for children's birthday parties and charitable events, who photographed himself in full costume with a painted smile and a wig and distributed those photographs to neighbors as a kind of personal calling card. He was the man who shook hands with First Lady Rosalind Carter at a Democratic Party event in 1978 and had that photograph framed. He was a man who ran for local office, attended community meetings, and was described by virtually everyone who encountered him as gregarious, generous, and exhausting in his social energy, the kind of person who fills every room he enters and who makes people feel, somehow, that they are the most important person he has spoken to all day. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, the son of a Danish-American mother and a Polish-American father who worked at a car manufacturing plant. His childhood was complicated by a difficult relationship with his father, who was by multiple accounts harsh and occasionally abusive, and who dismissed his son as effeminate and weak. Gacy struggled in school and with his health, experiencing unexplained blackouts during his teenage years that were eventually attributed to a heart condition. Despite these difficulties, he was by most accounts socially functional, and he moved to Springfield, Illinois as a young man to work as a management trainee for a shoe company, where he proved himself capable and ambitious. He married his first wife, Marlon Myers, in 1964, and the couple relocated to Waterloo, Iowa, where Gacy managed several Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants owned by his father-in-law. By external appearances, his life was proceeding normally. He and Marlon had 2 children. He joined the local JCs, the civic organization for young professionals, and threw himself into club activities with the same overwhelming energy that would define his public persona for the rest of his life. He became a JC's Man of the Year candidate. He organized events, raised money for charity, and built a reputation as someone the community could rely upon. In 1968, that first life collapsed. Gacy was charged with committing a sexual offense against a teenage male employee, to whom he had offered money in exchange for sexual acts and who had subsequently reported the encounter to authorities. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 years at the Iowa State Reformatory for Men. His wife Marlon divorced him during his incarceration. What is significant about this episode in the context of everything that followed is not only that it happened, but what happened next. Gacy was a model prisoner. He worked in the facility's kitchen, organized events, and was regarded by prison staff as cooperative, productive, and remorseful. He was released on parole after serving only 18 months of his 10-year sentence. That early release, granted because Gacy had so effectively performed the role of a rehabilitated man, was a decision that would haunt the justice system for decades. He returned to Chicago. He started a new construction company, PDM Contractors. He remarried a woman named Carol Hoff in 1972, a divorcee with 2 daughters, and the blended family moved into a ranch-style house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township, a quiet, unincorporated area just outside Chicago. Neighbors found Gacy personable and helpful. He threw elaborate parties in his backyard, complete with food, drinks, and entertainment. He dressed as Pogo the Clown at community events and performed magic tricks for children. His construction business grew steadily, employing teams of young men from the local area, many of them teenagers and young adults drawn by the promise of work and the approachable demeanor of their employer. It was through this network of young male employees, supplemented by his encounters in the local area, that Gacy began selecting his victims. His first confirmed act of fatal harm against another person occurred in 1972, the same year he remarried and started his business, a timing that underscores how completely he had constructed his second life before he began using it as cover for the first. The victim was Timothy McCoy, 16 years old. Gacy later told investigators that the act of taking McCoy's life produced a sensation he described as the ultimate thrill, and that from that moment forward he understood that what he had done once he would do again. Over the next 6 years, while PDM Contractors built its reputation and Gacy's social calendar filled with charity events and political functions and children's parties where he arrived in grease paint and a wig, he brought young men and teenage boys back to his home at Summerdale Avenue, and none of them left. His second wife Carol began to notice a persistent and unpleasant smell emanating from the crawl space beneath their home. Gacy told her it was moisture in the soil and that he would deal with it. She accepted the explanation. She later told investigators that she had noticed other things as well: young men who came to the house for work and did not return, a change in her husband's behavior, an increasing emotional distance, but that she had not known how to interpret these observations in a way that led anywhere. She divorced Gacy in 1976, citing his complete withdrawal from their relationship, and once she left the house at Summerdale Avenue, Gacy's activities escalated significantly. Without the constraint of a spouse present in the home, the pattern became more frequent and more brazen. By 1976, Gacy was committing what investigators would later determine were multiple acts of harm in a single year. His victims came from a variety of circumstances. Some were employees of PDM Contractors. Some were young men he encountered at bus stations or downtown Chicago locations. Some were individuals who had heard through word of mouth that Gacy offered cash work and had shown up at his door looking for employment. What they shared in almost every case was vulnerability. They were young, they needed money, They had no particular reason to distrust a successful, friendly contractor who seemed to be doing them a favor. Gacy had a specific method he used to incapacitate individuals who came to his home, involving a rope trick he called his handcuff trick, and he invited guests to try it themselves, turning the mechanism of his crimes into a social performance that seemed, in the moment, like entertainment. The final victim who brought the entire structure of Gacy's double life crashing down was 15-year-old Robert Piest, who disappeared from Des Plaines, Illinois on December 11, 1978. Piest had told his mother, before leaving their home that evening, that he was going to speak with a contractor about a summer job, and that he would be back soon. He gave her the name of the contractor. When Robert did not return, his mother went directly to the Des Plaines Police Department and gave them that name, John Wayne Gacy. This was the critical difference between Piest and many of Gacy's earlier victims. Piest came from a stable, attentive family who knew exactly where he had gone and who he had gone to see, and they reported his absence immediately. Police began investigating Gacy the following day. They found his 1968 Iowa conviction for sexual offense. They placed him under surveillance. Gacy, aware that investigators were watching him, began acting erratically, staying up through the night, driving aimlessly, and inviting police officers he knew socially to his home for drinks in what seemed to be an attempt to demonstrate normalcy. On December 21, 1978, police executed a search warrant of the Summerdale Avenue property. The smell in the crawl space that Carol Hoff had noticed years earlier told investigators everything before they had even begun to excavate. Over the days that followed, investigators recovered the remains of 26 young men and boys from the crawl space and from other areas of the property. For more victims were later recovered from the Des Plaines River, where Gacy had disposed of remains when the crawl space could hold no more. In total, 33 victims were identified, making Gacy, at the time of his conviction, the most prolific convicted serial killer in American history. Gacy was arrested on December 21, 1978, the same day the first search warrant was executed, and he eventually confessed to the killings while in custody. His trial began in February 1980 and lasted approximately 2 weeks. His defense team pursued an insanity argument, presenting the theory that Gacy suffered from a multiple personality disorder and that an alternate identity he called Jack had committed the crimes while Gacy himself was unaware. Prosecutors dismantled this argument systematically, presenting expert witnesses who testified that Gacy's behavior before, during, and after each act demonstrated deliberate planning and awareness, not the dissociation of a person with no control over his actions. The prosecution pointed to the rope trick, the basement drain that Gacy had installed specifically to manage what accumulated there, the way he selected victims and managed their disappearances, the elaborate social life he maintained as cover. None of this, they argued, was the behavior of a man who did not know what he was doing. The jury deliberated for 1 hour and 50 minutes and returned a verdict of guilty on all 33 counts of murder. The judge sentenced Gacy to death on 12 of the murders committed after Illinois reinstated its capital punishment statute in 1977, and to multiple life terms for the remaining 21. Gacy spent 14 years on death row, during which time he took up oil painting, producing dozens of works, many of them self-portraits in his Pogo the Clown costume, that were later sold at auction and became the subject of their own disturbing cultural conversation. He maintained his innocence in public statements and gave numerous media interviews in which he presented himself as a victim of prosecutorial misconduct. He was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Joliet, Illinois, on May 10, 1994. His last meal included fried chicken, which some observers noted with grim irony given his early career managing Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. His body was claimed by his family and cremated. In the decades since his execution, investigators have continued efforts to identify all of his victims. As recently as 2021, authorities were still using advances in DNA technology to put names to remains recovered from the Summerdale Avenue property in 1978. 5 victims remain unidentified to this day. Their families, if they exist, have spent more than 4 decades without knowing what happened to someone they loved, and the man responsible spent those same decades insisting, from death row, that the jury had gotten it wrong. Number 3. Harold Shipman, Dr. Death. In the entire recorded history of criminal investigation in the United Kingdom, No case has produced numbers as incomprehensible as those associated with Harold Frederick Shipman. Not the sheer volume of harm done, though that volume is without parallel. Not the duration over which it occurred, though that duration stretched across nearly a quarter of a century. What is most incomprehensible about the Shipman case is the mechanism through which it was allowed to continue for as long as it did, which was not secrecy or isolation or the cover of darkness, but the single most powerful social currency that exists between a person and another human being: trust. Harold Shipman was a doctor. He was the family doctor, the general practitioner, the man who had seen patients through the loss of spouses and the diagnosis of illnesses and the gradual physical decline of old age. He was the doctor who made house calls, who sat at the bedside, who held the hand of someone frightened and spoke in the calm, measured voice of medical authority. He was trusted completely because that is what doctors are, and that trust was the instrument through which he operated for 23 years without detection. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England, into a working-class family. His mother, Vera, was a woman he was deeply attached to, and her death from lung cancer when Shipman was 17 years old was an event that shaped him in ways that researchers and psychologists have spent years attempting to understand. What is known is that during his mother's illness, a doctor came to the family home regularly to administer injections of morphine, a medical-grade form of morphine used in palliative care, and that these injections provided Vera Shipman relief in her final weeks and that Harold witnessed them. Whether this experience planted something in him, whether it gave him a framework within which he later organized his own actions, is a question that has never been fully answered because Shipman himself never cooperated with investigators attempting to understand his motivations. He maintained his innocence until his death and never offered an explanation. After his mother's death, Shipman applied himself to his studies with renewed intensity and was accepted to Leeds University Medical School, where he trained as a physician. He qualified as a general practitioner and began working at the Abraham Ormond Medical Practice in Todmorden, West Yorkshire, in 1974. It was there, investigators would later determine through the exhaustive inquiry that followed his conviction, that he first began using his medical access to cause the deaths of patients under his care. His first confirmed victim, according to the inquiry chaired by Dame Janet Smith, was Eva Lyons, who died on March 17, 1975, the day before her 71st birthday, while Shipman was attending to her at her home. She had been suffering from cancer and her death was attributed to the natural progression of her illness. No one questioned it. There was no reason to. Her doctor had been present, he had completed the death certificate, and the cause listed was entirely consistent with her medical history. That was the template Shipman would follow for the next 23 years. He relocated to Hyde, Greater Manchester, and joined the Donnybrook House Group practice, where he worked from the late 1970s until 1992. During this period he continued his pattern of causing the deaths of patients during home visits, always selecting elderly patients whose deaths could be attributed to natural causes and whose medical records he falsified afterward to make them appear sicker than they actually were. In 1992, Shipman left the group practice and established himself as a solo general practitioner operating from a surgery on Market Street in Hyde. Working alone, without colleagues who might observe his patterns, his rate of causing patient deaths increased significantly. The inquiry would later establish that the majority of his confirmed victims died after 1992, during this solo practice period. His patients, almost exclusively elderly women from the Hyde community, trusted him completely. He was known for making house calls, for being attentive and warm, for taking time with patients that other busy doctors did not always have. His waiting room was full. His reputation in the community was excellent. People fought to be registered with Harold Shipman's practice because they considered themselves fortunate to have a doctor who cared. The mechanism he used was consistent across virtually all of his confirmed cases. During a home visit, he would administer a lethal dose of morphine, the same drug he had watched relieve his mother's suffering decades earlier, by injection. The patient would lose consciousness rapidly and die within minutes. Shipman would then complete the death certificate, listing the cause of death as heart failure or old age or the natural progression of whatever condition the patient was already known to have. He would collect his medical bag and leave the home, sometimes encountering family members in the hallway on his way out. expressing condolences in the composed and professional manner of a physician who has witnessed death many times and has learned to carry it with dignity. He forged medical records systematically to ensure that his documentation supported the cause of death he had recorded. He had access to gemorphine because general practitioners in the United Kingdom at that time could legally possess and prescribe controlled substances, and Shipman overprescribed the drug to patients, collected the excess himself, and retained it. The pharmaceutical mechanism of his crimes was, in a very real sense, authorized by the system that employed him. The case against Harold Shipman did not begin with the concerns of a law enforcement agency or the suspicions of a colleague. It began with a taxi driver. A local funeral director in Hyde had noticed, over a period of time, that an unusually high proportion of Shipman's patients were dying, and that they were dying at home rather than in hospital, and that the circumstances were often strikingly similar. The patient found seated or reclining, often fully clothed, often in circumstances that suggested they had been expecting a visit rather than preparing for death. The funeral director raised concerns informally. A local general practitioner, Dr. Linda Reynolds, heard these concerns and took them seriously enough to report them to the South Manchester Coroner's Office in 1997. The coroner investigated and found insufficient evidence to pursue the matter further. Shipman continued practicing. The final victim whose death triggered the investigation that ended his freedom was Kathleen Grundy, 81 years old, a former mayor of Hyde and a woman of considerable standing in the local community. Grundy died on June 24, 1998, and Shipman signed her death certificate listing old age as the cause. Shortly after her death, her daughter Angela Woodruff, herself a solicitor, was contacted by a firm of lawyers claiming to hold a copy of a recently revised will under which Kathleen Grundy had left her entire estate, valued at approximately £386,000, to her doctor Harold Shipman. Angela Woodruff, who was her mother's own solicitor and who had handled her legal affairs for years, knew with certainty that this will was not authentic. She reported it to the police. Investigators began examining Kathleen Grundy's death and ordered an exhumation of her body. The toxicological analysis of Grundy's remains revealed a fatal concentration of gemorphine, a drug she had no medical reason to have received. Shipman was arrested on September 7, 1998. As investigators began examining his patient records and his prescribing history, the scale of what they had uncovered became clear. They applied to exhume the bodies of other former patients. Case after case produced the same toxicological findings. The death certificates all bore Shipman's name. The medical records had all been altered to support natural causes. The pattern, once investigators knew what to look for, was unmistakable. Shipman's trial opened at Preston Crown Court in October 1999, with the prosecution presenting 15 counts of murder, the cases for which the strongest physical evidence existed following exhumation. Shipman pleaded not guilty to all 15 charges. His defense offered no alternative explanation for the toxicological findings, no theory under which a fatal concentration of gemorphine had entered the bodies of 15 patients whose death certificates Shipman had personally signed. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on all 15 counts on January 31, 2000. Mr. Justice Forbes, in passing sentence, addressed Shipman directly from the bench in language that has been widely quoted as one of the most devastating judicial statements in British legal history. The judge observed that each of Shipman's victims had been his patient, had trusted him entirely, and had very likely thanked him as he administered the treatment that ended their life. He sentenced Shipman to 15 terms of life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning he would never be released, and added a 4-year concurrent sentence for the forgery of Kathleen Grundy's will. The judge departed from judicial convention to state publicly, in open court, that his recommendation to the Home Secretary was that Shipman spend every remaining day of his life in prison. Shipman was sent to HM Prison Wakefield, a high-security facility in West Yorkshire known colloquially as Monster Mansion for the severity of the crimes committed by those housed within its walls. He continued to maintain his innocence and refused to cooperate with the subsequent government inquiry ordered to determine the full scope of his crimes. Dame Janet Smith's inquiry, which produced a 6-volume report over several years, concluded that Shipman had caused the deaths of at least 215 patients and that there was a further real suspicion surrounding approximately 45 additional deaths. The inquiry also found that the systems designed to regulate medical practice and detect patterns of abnormal patient mortality had failed comprehensively, and it produced a series of landmark recommendations that reshaped how the medical profession in the United Kingdom is monitored and regulated. On January 13, 2004, one day before his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman was found dead in his cell at Wakefield Prison. He had used bedsheets to hang himself during the night. He left no note and no explanation. The families of his victims, many of whom had hoped to eventually receive some account of why he had done what he did, were denied even that. The question of motive remains officially unanswered to this day. Some researchers have pointed to the diamorphine administered to his dying mother as a formative experience. Others have suggested that Shipman derived a sense of power from the ability to determine when a life ended. Others still have proposed that he felt contempt for the elderly patients who were entirely dependent on him, and that the killings were an expression of that contempt. None of these explanations has ever been confirmed, because the one person who could have provided confirmation chose, in the end, to take the answer with him. What he left behind was the largest body count of any convicted serial killer in modern British history, an inquiry that fundamentally changed the regulation of the medical profession and the memory of 215 people, mostly elderly women from a small town in Greater Manchester, who died trusting the man who was supposed to be keeping them alive. Number 4. Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. For more than 4 decades, the person responsible for one of the most prolonged and geographically extensive crime sprees in California's history lived in plain sight, mowing his lawn, attending to his garden, going to work in the morning and coming home in the evening like any other man on any other quiet suburban street in Northern California. He was a former police officer. He understood investigation from the inside. He knew how evidence was gathered, how suspects were identified, how the machinery of law enforcement operated, and he used that knowledge to remain invisible for 43 years while the people whose lives he had entered, and whose lives he had permanently altered, grew older and continued to live with the damage he had done without ever knowing who had done it. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York. He grew up in a military family and spent parts of his childhood in different locations before the family settled in Auburn, California. He served in the United States Navy during the Vietnam War and returned to civilian life with a degree in criminal justice from California State University, Sacramento. He joined the Exeter Police Department in Tulare County, California in 1973, becoming a law enforcement officer in the same state where he would later operate for more than a decade as a criminal. He was described by colleagues as competent and unremarkable. He transferred to the Auburn Police Department in Placer County in 1976, where he worked until 1979, when he was fired after being caught shoplifting a can of dog repellent and a hammer from a local drugstore. A petty theft that resulted in his termination from the force. The significance of the items he was caught stealing would not be understood for another 40 years. After his dismissal from law enforcement, DeAngelo went to work as a truck mechanic and later as a distribution warehouse employee. He married a woman named Sharon Huddle, an attorney, and the couple lived together in Citrus Heights, then in Roseville, California. He had daughters. He had a garden. Neighbors recalled him as a man who kept to himself, occasionally yelled at people who came too close to his lawn, and was otherwise unremarkable, the kind of neighbor you might wave to from the driveway without ever having a real conversation. While this ordinary suburban life proceeded, investigators across 11 California counties were trying, and failing, to identify the person responsible for a pattern of crimes that had begun in 1975 and would not end until 1986. The case had accumulated multiple names across multiple jurisdictions over the years. In Visalia in 1975 and 1976, a prowler known as the Visalia Ransacker had broken into hundreds of homes, stealing small personal items and leaving minimal physical evidence. In Sacramento and surrounding areas from 1976 to 1979, a perpetrator known as the East Area Rapist had committed a series of crimes in residential neighborhoods, often spending time in the surrounding area before and after each incident. And in Southern California from 1979 to 1986, a perpetrator known as the Original Night Stalker, later renamed the Golden State Killer after true crime author Michelle McNamara popularized the term in her widely read investigation, had been linked to 13 murders and multiple additional attacks. Investigators did not initially realize that all 3 designations referred to the same person. It was only through the painstaking work of forensic genealogists decades later that the connections were conclusively established. D'Angelo's crimes, as investigators would eventually determine, began while he was actively employed as a police officer. His first known crimes in Visalia in 1975 occurred while he was on the force in Exeter. His first attacks in the Sacramento area in 1976 and 1977 occurred while he was a sworn law enforcement officer in Auburn. He used his training to select targets strategically, to approach neighborhoods in ways that minimized his chances of detection, and to engage with potential witnesses in a manner that did not raise suspicion. He reportedly owned a police scanner and monitored law enforcement communications during his activities. He cut phone lines before approaching residences. He studied neighborhoods over extended periods before acting. Everything he did reflected an understanding of investigative procedure that came directly from his professional training, and he turned that training entirely against the communities it was supposed to protect. When he was dismissed from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting, the crimes attributed to the East Area rapist in Sacramento stopped. The crimes attributed to the original Night Stalker in Southern California then began and continued until 1986. Then they stopped entirely. D'Angelo, now working as a truck mechanic and later in a warehouse, appears to have simply ceased. He raised his daughters. He tended his garden. He grew older. The cases went cold. Investigators across multiple California counties had spent years collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses and building profiles of the person responsible, and they had arrived at a general picture: a methodical, organized individual with knowledge of law enforcement procedure, likely a white male, likely with military or law enforcement background, but they had no name, no face, no arrest. For the survivors of his crimes, and for the families of those who had died, the absence of any resolution was a wound that simply did not close. In the late 2010s, a revolution in forensic genealogy began to change the landscape of cold case investigation across the United States. Investigators could now take DNA recovered from crime scenes and search it against publicly accessible genealogical databases, the kind that ordinary people used to trace their ancestry, to identify distant relatives of an unknown suspect. By tracing family trees forward from those relatives, investigators could narrow the field of possible matches to a handful of individuals, then collect additional DNA from those individuals for direct comparison. In the Golden State Killer case, this technique was applied in 2017 and 2018 by a team working with the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office and the FBI. They found a distant relative match in the GED-Match public database. They built the family tree forward. They arrived at a name: Joseph James D'Angelo Jr., 72 years old, living in Citrus Heights, California. Investigators placed him under surveillance. They collected a DNA sample from a tissue he discarded in a public place and from the door handle of his car. The samples were compared to DNA recovered from crime scenes spanning 4 decades. The match was confirmed across multiple locations. On April 24, 2018, investigators moved to arrest Joseph James D'Angelo at his home in Citrus Heights. He was found in his driveway. He was taken into custody without incident. When confronted by investigators in the interrogation room shortly after his arrest, before he had been formally advised of the charges against him, he was recorded saying, "I did all that." He was 72 years old. He had been living 25 miles from Sacramento for years. On June 29, 2020, in proceedings conducted in a Sacramento State University ballroom converted into a makeshift courtroom to accommodate the number of attendees and to allow social distancing during the COVID-19 pandemic, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 rape-related kidnapping charges under a plea agreement that spared him the death penalty. He also publicly admitted to an additional 148 crimes for which the statute of limitations had expired, meaning they could not be formally prosecuted. In total, prosecutors described his admitted criminal conduct as encompassing 87 victims across 53 separate crime scenes in 11 California counties. The 4-day sentencing hearing that followed in August 2020 produced testimony from dozens of survivors and family members of victims. D'Angelo sat in a wheelchair for the proceedings and said nothing for the first 3 days, listening to survivor after survivor describe the lasting impact of what he had done to their lives, their relationships, their sense of safety in their own homes. On the final day, before the sentence was handed down, he rose from the wheelchair, removed his face mask, and addressed the court. He said, "I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt." The room did not respond with forgiveness. Sacramento County Superior Court Judge Michael Bowman sentenced D'Angelo to 11 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus additional concurrent and consecutive terms, amounting to a total sentence under which he will die in prison. The judge stated from the bench that D'Angelo would meet his death confined behind the walls of a state penitentiary. D'Angelo's ex-wife Sharon Huddle submitted a court filing stating that she had been deceived throughout their marriage and had no knowledge of his crimes. His daughters have not spoken publicly. He is currently incarcerated at a California State Correctional Facility, where he will remain until he dies. The Golden State Killer case is now taught as a landmark example of investigative genetic genealogy and its application to cold case investigation, and it fundamentally changed the legal and ethical conversation around the use of public DNA databases in criminal investigations. For the survivors, the resolution arrived 40 years too late to undo the damage, but the confirmation of a name, the knowledge that the person who had altered the entire course of their lives was a now elderly man in a wheelchair saying that he was sorry, was something they had spent decades believing might never come. Number 5. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. There is something particularly chilling about a man who goes to church on Sunday morning, sings hymns alongside his neighbors, and then spends the rest of his week operating as the most prolific convicted serial killer in American history. Gary Leon Ridgway did exactly that. He was a church-going man. He read the Bible aloud to his girlfriends and later to his wives. He carried scripture with him to work. He spoke about his faith with the ease and familiarity of someone for whom religion was not a performance but a genuine part of daily life, woven into the rhythm of his routine alongside breakfast and the morning commute and the particular satisfaction he took in his work as a commercial truck painter. And for 20 years, while the women of King County, Washington disappeared one after another and the Green River Task Force grew into one of the largest and most resource-intensive criminal investigations in the history of the Pacific Northwest, Gary Ridgway drove to his job at the Kenworth truck manufacturing plant in Renton, clocked in, applied paint to the bodies of heavy commercial vehicles with the careful attention of a skilled tradesman, and clocked out. He was married 3 times. He was a father. He owned a house in Auburn, Washington, a modest ranch-style property in a quiet residential neighborhood, the kind of house with a driveway and a lawn and a mailbox and nothing about its exterior that would cause anyone to slow their car and look twice. His co-workers at Kenworth described him as reliable, friendly, and unremarkable. His neighbors described him as quiet and courteous. His pastors, at the various churches he attended over the years, described him as devout. None of them were lying. That was the genuine impression Gary Ridgway made on everyone around him because the person those people encountered was real. He did go to church, he did read scripture, he did show up to work every day and do his job well. And the other Gary Ridgway, the one who was responsible for the deaths of at least 49 women across a period of nearly 2 decades, existed in a parallel compartment that the people in his life were never permitted to see. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, and grew up in the Seattle area, the middle of 3 brothers in a working-class family. His early life was characterized by academic difficulty. He was a poor student who struggled to read and who repeated several grades, and by a complicated home environment shaped by a domineering mother whom Ridgway later described in interviews as a source of intense and conflicted feelings. He enlisted in the United States Navy after high school and served aboard a supply ship during the Vietnam War era, an experience during which he visited ports where he engaged with female sex workers and later described feeling both drawn to and resentful of those encounters. After his discharge, he returned to the Seattle area, married for the first time, fathered a son named Matthew, and took a job at Kenworth Truck that he would hold for the next 32 years. His first marriage ended in divorce. His second marriage also ended in divorce. He married his third wife, Judith Lynch, in 1988, in a ceremony at a local park. Judith later told investigators that she had no idea who she had married, that her husband had seemed to her like an ordinary man who worked hard and went to church and loved his family, and that the revelation of what he had actually been doing throughout their marriage was something she could not reconcile with the person she believed she knew. In 1982, The body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield was found floating in the Green River between Kent and Tukwila, Washington. Over the weeks and months that followed, additional bodies were discovered in and around the river, and the King County Sheriff's Office established a dedicated task force to investigate what had become apparent as a pattern of targeted harm against young women in the area. The victims were predominantly young women who were working as street-level sex workers along the Pacific Highway South Corridor in the unincorporated areas of King County, a stretch of road lined with motels and commercial establishments where women gathered to find clients. Ridgway later explained his target selection in language so cold and deliberate that it became one of the most frequently quoted statements in the history of serial crime investigation. He told investigators that he chose his victims because he believed he could harm as many of them as he wanted without being caught, because their disappearances would not trigger the same level of investigative urgency as those of women in more conventional circumstances. He understood, with the calculation of someone who had thought it through carefully, that the social position of his victims made them vulnerable not only to him but to the indifference of systems that would prove slow to respond. And he was correct. For years, the Green River Task Force operated with enormous effort and limited resources, hampered by the sheer number of cases, the transient nature of the victim population, and the absence of any physical evidence directly linking a specific individual to the crimes. Ridgway came to the task force's attention relatively early. He had been named by a victim who survived an encounter with him in 1982, and investigators spoke with him that year. He passed a polygraph examination in 1984 and was effectively cleared from the active suspect list. In 1987, as part of a renewed investigative effort, the task force collected a saliva sample from Ridgway and a small number of other suspects for DNA analysis. But the technology of 1987 was not sufficiently advanced to produce a meaningful comparison from the available crime scene material, and the sample was stored without producing a result. Ridgway knew he had been spoken to. He knew he had been tested. He continued going to work at Kenworth, continued attending church, continued living his life in Auburn with his third wife, and continued, throughout the 1980s, adding to a body count that law enforcement would not be able to confirm for another 15 years. The Green River Task Force, which at its peak employed dozens of detectives and had accumulated thousands of pages of investigative material, was significantly scaled back in the early 1990s as the active discoveries of new victims slowed and budgetary pressures mounted. The investigation was not abandoned, but it was no longer the consuming priority it had been. Ridgway's final known act of harm was committed in 1998. In 2001, King County Sheriff Dave Reichert, who had been the first detective assigned to the Green River case in 1982 and who had never stopped pursuing it, convened a meeting to re-examine the stored physical evidence using DNA technology that had advanced dramatically since the 1987 collection. The stored saliva sample from Ridgway was compared to DNA recovered from 4 of the victims. The match was confirmed across all 4. Ridgway was arrested on November 30, 2001, at his workplace at the Kenworth plant in Renton, taken into custody in front of colleagues who had worked alongside him for decades and who, by every account, were genuinely stunned. He was charged initially with 4 counts of aggravated murder, each of which carried the possibility of a death sentence. The investigation that followed his arrest was unlike anything King County had previously managed. Ridgway, facing execution, entered into negotiations with prosecutors that would ultimately shape the resolution of the case entirely. He offered something that the families of victims needed desperately and that no investigation could provide on its own: knowledge of where the remaining bodies were. He knew where he had placed his victims because he had placed them deliberately, returning to some locations afterward, and he retained those locations in his memory with a precision that shocked the detectives who worked with him over the months of his cooperation. The deal that was reached between Ridgway's defense team and the King County Prosecutor's Office was controversial and painful for many of the families involved. In exchange for Ridgway's cooperation in locating additional remains and providing a full accounting of his crimes, prosecutors agreed to take the death penalty off the table and to seek instead a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Many family members of victims opposed the agreement publicly and passionately, arguing that Ridgway deserved execution and that sparing him in exchange for information rewarded the very calculation he had made when he chose his victims, the calculation that they were disposable. Others, particularly those whose loved ones had never been found, accepted the agreement as the only realistic path to any kind of resolution. Over the summer of 2003, Ridgway led investigators to additional sets of remains, fulfilling the cooperation requirement of the agreement. On November 5, 2003, Gary Leon Ridgway appeared in King County Superior Court and entered guilty pleas to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. He read a statement in which he said he was sorry for the pain he had caused, bowing his head and speaking in a subdued voice. The families of victims who were present in the courtroom that day had waited, in some cases, more than 20 years for any accounting from the man responsible, and the statement they received, procedural, controlled, offering no genuine insight into why or how a man who sang hymns on Sunday mornings had done what he had done, satisfied virtually none of them. King County Superior Court Judge Richard Jones, at the sentencing hearing on December 18, 2003, paused the proceedings before passing sentence to observe a 48-second moment of silence, 1 second for each victim to whom a count of guilty had been entered. He then addressed Ridgway directly, describing his conduct as a reign of terror and stating that the time had come for the community to have peace from the Green River murders. He sentenced Ridgway to 48 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 480 years for evidence tampering, 10 years per victim. In 2011, additional remains were identified as belonging to Rebecca Marrero, a victim who had not previously been formally attributed to Ridgway. He appeared in court again and pleaded guilty to a 49th count of first-degree murder, receiving a 49th consecutive life term. He is currently serving those sentences at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he remains as of 2026, 77 years old. In recent years, according to reporting by the Seattle Times, Ridgway was briefly transferred from the penitentiary after telling investigators he believed he could help them find the remains of additional victims. He was taken to King County and accompanied detectives to multiple locations. Whether any additional remains were recovered as a result of that effort has not been publicly confirmed. Investigators have noted that his memory for locations has remained specific and detailed even decades later, a fact that speaks not to any redemptive quality in Ridgway but to the organized, deliberate nature of what he did and the care with which he managed it across 20 years. The last victim formally identified in his case was 15-year-old Lori and Razpotnik, whose remains, found in 1985, were confirmed through DNA analysis in December 2023, 41 years after her disappearance. There are families still waiting. Number 6. Ted Bundy. The name Ted Bundy has become, in the decades since his execution, something approaching a cultural shorthand for a specific and deeply unsettling idea. That charm and intelligence and good looks and social fluency are not indicators of character, that they are tools and that in the wrong hands they are among the most dangerous tools that exist. Theodore Robert Bundy was not the first person to use likability as a mechanism for gaining the trust of those he intended to harm, but he did it with a consistency and a sophistication that made him the defining case in the public understanding of predatory behavior disguised as normalcy. He was genuinely intelligent. He was genuinely charming. The people who knew him, his longtime girlfriend Elizabeth Klopfer, his colleagues at the Washington State Republican Party where he worked as a volunteer, his professors at the University of Washington where he studied psychology, the attorneys at the law office where he clerked while attending law school, all of them described him in terms that were not merely polite social convention but reflected something real about the impression he made. He was interesting to talk to. He was helpful and attentive. He remembered details about people and brought them up in subsequent conversations in ways that made people feel valued. He was the kind of person who made those around him feel that they had his full and genuine attention, which is a rare enough quality that it tends to produce strong loyalty in those who experience it. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, to a young unmarried woman named Eleanor Louise Cowell, who was 22 years old at the time of his birth. The circumstances of his parentage were complicated and deliberately obscured by his family. For a significant portion of his childhood, Bundy was raised believing that his maternal grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister. A deception maintained, family members later suggested, to protect the family's reputation in a social environment where an unmarried woman with a child carried significant stigma. Bundy learned the truth about his parentage at some point in his adolescence, and the impact of that discovery on his psychological development has been the subject of considerable speculation, though no definitive causal link between that revelation and his later crimes has ever been established. He grew up in Tacoma, Washington, where his mother had relocated after marrying a man named Johnny Bundy, whose surname Ted eventually adopted. By the accounts of those who knew him in Tacoma, he was a good student, socially competent, and showed no obvious signs of the internal world that he was apparently already constructing. He attended the University of Washington, where he studied psychology, and he became involved in Republican Party politics, working on gubernatorial campaigns and building connections with political figures in Washington state that led at least one prominent person to write him a letter of recommendation for law school, a letter written in genuine good faith by someone who genuinely believed in the young man they were recommending. He was accepted to law school in Utah and began his studies there in 1974. By 1974, he had already begun harming people. The disappearances of young women in Washington state that investigators would eventually attribute to Bundy began in January of that year. Linda and Healy, a 21-year-old student and campus radio host at the University of Washington, disappeared on February 1, 1974, from her basement room near the university campus. Her roommates found evidence the following morning that something had occurred in her room, but Linda was gone and offered no further information. She was the first of a series of young women, Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball, Georgian Hawkins, who disappeared from the Seattle and Tacoma area in the first half of 1974, each disappearance distinct in its circumstances but collectively forming a pattern that investigators recognized and struggled to explain. In July 1974, at Lake Sammamish State Park, a man who identified himself to witnesses as Ted approached multiple young women over the course of a single afternoon, his arm in a sling, asking for help loading a small sailboat onto his vehicle. Two of those women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, agreed to help him and did not return. Multiple witnesses later gave police a description of the man and confirmed his first name. The composite image and the name circulated widely in the Seattle area, and Elizabeth Klopfer, who was Bundy's girlfriend at the time, contacted the police tip line and provided his name. Investigators spoke with Bundy briefly and found him, like everyone else did, entirely convincing. He was polite, cooperative, and articulate. He had no criminal record. The tip was noted and not immediately pursued. Bundy, by this point, had relocated to Utah to begin law school, and the disappearances in Washington ceased. They began again in Utah. Carol Duranch narrowly escaped an encounter with him in November 1974 in Murray, Utah, when a man who identified himself as a police officer approached her in a shopping mall parking lot, told her that someone had attempted to break into her car, and asked her to accompany him to the police station to file a report. She got into his Volkswagen Beetle. Within minutes she realized something was deeply wrong, and she managed to open the car door and flee while the vehicle was still moving. Her account became the most detailed first-hand description of Bundy's method that investigators would have for several years. Bundy moved to Colorado to continue his legal education, and young women began disappearing in Colorado. He was eventually identified as a suspect in multiple states, arrested in Utah in 1975 after a routine traffic stop during which an officer found suspicious items in his car, and charged with the aggravated kidnapping of Carol Duranch. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison, a sentence he began serving while simultaneously becoming the primary suspect in multiple murder investigations across Washington, Utah, and Colorado. In 1977, facing a first-degree murder charge in Colorado, he escaped from a Pitkin County courthouse by jumping from a second-floor window while reviewing law library materials. He was recaptured 8 days later. In December 1977, he escaped again, this time from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, where he had been awaiting trial. He had lost significant weight deliberately in the preceding weeks, small enough now to squeeze through a ceiling panel in his cell and make his way through the facility's infrastructure to freedom. He was not discovered missing for 15 hours. He made his way to Chicago, then to Ann Arbor, Michigan, then to Atlanta, and finally to Tallahassee, Florida, where he rented a room near the Florida State University campus under a false name and attempted, for a period of weeks, to build a new life. On the night of January 14th and into the early morning hours of January 15th, 1978, 4 years to the day after the BTK killer's first attack on the Otero family in Wichita, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University and moved through the building while its residents slept. 2 young women, 21-year-old Margaret Bowman and 20-year-old Lisa Levy, died that night. 3 others were injured in their rooms. Later that same night, Bundy entered a separate residence several blocks from the sorority house and injured a fourth woman, Cheryl Thomas, so severely that she suffered permanent hearing loss and balance impairment. Investigators had no immediate suspect. On February 9, 1978, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach disappeared from Lake City, Florida. She was the youngest of Bundy's confirmed victims. Her remains were found 2 months later in a state park in Suwannee County. Bundy was finally captured for the last time on February 15, 1978, in Pensacola, Florida, when a police officer on routine patrol ran the plates of a Volkswagen Beetle driving through a residential neighborhood at 2 in the morning and found that the vehicle had been reported stolen. The officer approached the car and asked the driver to step out. Bundy attempted to flee on foot and was physically apprehended after a brief struggle, during which the officer later stated that he believed he was fighting for his life. At the time of his arrest, Bundy was carrying multiple forms of false identification and had credit cards belonging to other individuals. He was transported to the Leon County Jail, where he was identified. The investigation that followed confirmed the connections between Bundy and the Chi Omega attacks through bite mark evidence. Bundy had left a distinctive bite mark on Lisa Levy, and forensic odontologist Dr. Richard Souvern testified at trial that the mark was consistent with Bundy's dental impressions to a degree of certainty that he described as overwhelming. Bundy's trial for the Chi Omega murders opened in Miami in June 1979 and was the first murder trial in American history to be broadcast live on national television. He chose to represent himself for portions of the proceedings, delivering opening and closing arguments with the confidence of someone who had studied law and who still, even in a courtroom, could not entirely suppress the compulsion to perform. He was charismatic and organized and entirely without the external markers that popular imagination associates with a person who had done what he had done. Jurors later described the experience of sitting across from him daily as profoundly disorienting. He seemed so normal, so articulate, so human, and the evidence against him was so conclusive that reconciling the two required a kind of cognitive effort they had not anticipated. The jury deliberated and returned a guilty verdict on July 24, 1979. Bundy was sentenced to death for the murders of Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman. He was subsequently tried separately for the murder of Kimberly Leach and received a second death sentence. He spent nearly a decade on death row at Florida State Prison, during which time he gave extensive interviews to investigators and researchers, married a woman named Carol and Boone in a courtroom during his own trial by exploiting a Florida legal provision, and fathered a daughter whose identity has been carefully protected. In the final days before his scheduled execution, Bundy began providing detailed confessions to investigators from multiple states in an apparent attempt to delay his execution by demonstrating his usefulness as a source of information about unsolved cases. He confessed to 30 murders across 7 states. He suggested to investigators that his actual victim count might extend into the triple digits, a claim that some researchers have taken seriously given the number of unsolved disappearances of young women across the western United States during the period of his activity. The confessions did not delay his execution. On January 24, 1989, at 7 in the morning, Theodore Robert Bundy was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison in Rayford. A crowd that had gathered outside the prison cheered when the hearse carrying his body departed the facility. He was 42 years old. His ashes, at his own request, were scattered in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, the same mountain range where he had disposed of at least 4 of his victims, a final act of self-mythology from a man who had spent his entire life constructing a version of himself that the world would find compelling. His former girlfriend Elizabeth Klopfer, who had reported him to police twice during his active years, and who he had once told over the phone that he had tried to harm her, wrote a memoir about her experience. His daughter, whose existence was confirmed through DNA testing years after his death, has never spoken publicly. The families of his confirmed victims, 30 of them spread across 7 states, have spent their lives navigating grief complicated by the fact that the man responsible became a cultural celebrity, the subject of films and documentaries and podcasts and books, a figure whose name is more famous than any of the people he harmed. Number 7. Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Cannibal. The apartment at 213 Oxford Apartments, number 213, on North 25th Street in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, was by any observable measure an entirely unremarkable place. It was a 1-bedroom unit in a working-class residential building in a low-income neighborhood. The man who lived there worked the night shift at the Ambrosia Chocolate Company, a factory job he had held for several years. He was quiet. He did not cause disturbances. His neighbors occasionally noticed an unpleasant smell, and some had raised the issue with building management, but unpleasant smells in residential buildings are common enough, and the explanations offered, spoiled meat in the refrigerator, a drainage issue, were not inherently implausible. The man himself, when encountered in the hallways or the laundry room, was polite and soft-spoken. He kept to himself. He had no visible social life, no regular visitors, no obvious eccentricities. He was the kind of tenant who registers as background, present, unremarkable, forgotten the moment you turn away. His name was Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, and the apartment at Oxford on 25th Street contained evidence of crimes so extreme in their nature that when investigators finally entered it on the night of July 22, 1991, they initially struggled to process what they were seeing. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the first child of Lionel Dahmer, an analytical chemist, and Joyce Dahmer, a teletype machine instructor. His early childhood in Bath Township, Ohio, was by external measures ordinary, a middle-class upbringing in a suburban home with two parents and, eventually, a younger brother named David. Lionel Dahmer, who later wrote a memoir attempting to understand his son, described Jeffrey as a cheerful and curious child in his earliest years, and noted that something appeared to shift around the time of a hernia operation Jeffrey underwent at age 4, after which he seemed more subdued and withdrawn. Whether that observation was accurate or retrospectively constructed to explain what followed is impossible to determine. What is established is that by early adolescence, Dahmer had developed an intense preoccupation with dissection and the examination of animal remains. He collected roadkill. He used chemicals from his father's home laboratory to strip flesh from bones. He mounted the results on sticks in the woods behind the family home. His father, discovering these activities, interpreted them as a morbid but not necessarily alarming curiosity in a boy with scientific interests, and this interpretation, made in good faith, was another in the long series of missed moments that characterized the case. By high school, Dahmer was drinking heavily. He carried a briefcase containing a cup of scotch and orange juice to school and consumed it during class, a behavior his teachers noticed and did not fully address. His academic performance deteriorated. His parents' marriage collapsed in an acrimonious divorce that left both Lionel and Joyce Dahmer consumed with their own circumstances. When Lionel left the family home and Joyce relocated with David to Wisconsin, Jeffrey was left alone in the house in Ohio for a period of weeks, an 18-year-old with no supervision, no routine, and no one monitoring his behavior. It was during this period, in the summer of 1978, that Jeffrey Dahmer encountered Stephen Hicks, a 19-year-old hitchhiker from Bath, Ohio, who was on his way to a rock concert. Dahmer invited Hicks back to the empty house. When Hicks attempted to leave, Dahmer prevented him. Hicks became the first of Dahmer's 17 confirmed victims. Dahmer disposed of the remains on the property and, over the following years, returned periodically to ensure that nothing had surfaced. After that summer of 1978, Dahmer enrolled briefly at Ohio State University, where he lasted one semester before dropping out. His father, attempting to provide structure, arranged for him to enlist in the United States Army. Dahmer served as a medic at a base in Freiburg, West Germany, from 1979 to 1981. His superiors described him as technically competent but increasingly problematic due to his drinking, and he was discharged from the Army before completing his full term of service. He spent time in Florida, then returned to the Midwest, eventually settling in Milwaukee in the early 1980s, where he moved in with his grandmother in the suburb of West Allis. His grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, was fond of her grandson and described him as a respectful and helpful presence in her home. He attended church with her. He helped around the house. He found work. There were incidents during the West Allis period, a brief arrest for indecent exposure at a county fair in 1982, a second incident in 1986, that were processed through the court system without triggering any deeper investigation into the man behind them. In 1988, his grandmother asked him to move out, not because she suspected anything, but because his late hours and the occasional strange smells and the general disorder of his life in her home had become difficult for her to manage. He moved to the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street. He found the factory job at Ambrosia Chocolate. He settled into the unremarkable routine that his neighbors would later struggle to reconcile with the truth. Between 1988 and 1991, Dahmer brought 14 young men to that apartment. His victims were predominantly young Black, Hispanic, and Asian men, many of them from the surrounding neighborhood, whom he met in bars, shopping malls, and adult bookstores in the Milwaukee area. He offered them money to accompany him back to his apartment, initially framing the proposition as payment for posing for photographs. Once inside the apartment, he would offer his guests a drink into which he had dissolved sedative medication. When his guest lost consciousness, Dahmer caused their death by manual means and then engaged in a process of dismemberment and disposal that he conducted entirely within the apartment, in the bathroom and the kitchen, over the course of subsequent hours and days, while continuing to go to work at the chocolate factory and maintain his outward routine. He kept records. He kept photographs. He retained certain remains and stored others in various containers within the apartment, including a large drum purchased specifically for that purpose. The smell that neighbors occasionally noticed and reported to building management was the consequence of this preservation process, and the explanations Dahmer offered, a broken freezer, spoiled meat, satisfied building management sufficiently that no thorough investigation of the unit was ever conducted. On July 22, 1991, a young man named Tracy Edwards managed to escape from Dahmer's apartment with a handcuff still attached to his wrist and flagged down two Milwaukee police officers, Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller, on North 25th Street. He told them that a man inside the building had threatened him and tried to restrain him. The officers accompanied Edwards back to apartment 213 and spoke with Dahmer, who was calm and cooperative and offered a plausible explanation for the handcuff. A disagreement that had gotten out of hand, he said, and initially managed to project the same reasonable, unfrightening impression he had spent years cultivating. It was only when Officer Mueller went to retrieve the handcuff key from the bedroom that the reality of the apartment became impossible to dismiss. Inside the refrigerator in the kitchen, Mueller found a human head. The officers placed Dahmer under arrest. The subsequent search of the apartment lasted through the night and into the following days and produced findings that required investigators to suspend their ordinary professional frameworks and simply process, methodically and without the luxury of time for reflection, what was in front of them. In total, the remains of 11 individuals were recovered from the apartment. Photographs taken by Dahmer were recovered documenting the crimes in detail. A 57-gallon drum containing additional remains was found in the bedroom. A freezer contained further biological material. The building was subsequently sealed and eventually demolished. News of the discovery spread through Milwaukee and then nationally within hours, and the reaction was one of collective disbelief that had at its center a question that was, in retrospect, entirely understandable. How had no one known? Dahmer was charged with 15 counts of first-degree murder in Milwaukee County. The 11 victims found in the apartment plus 4 additional victims connected to him through forensic evidence and his own subsequent confession. He later faced an additional charge in Ohio for the 1978 death of Stephen Hicks, to which he also pleaded guilty. His trial opened in Milwaukee County Court before Judge Lawrence Graham in January 1992. Dahmer pleaded guilty but insane, acknowledging that he had committed the acts charged, while arguing that a mental disease or defect had rendered him unable to conform his conduct to the law. The proceeding therefore became, by legal design, a trial solely on the question of his mental state at the time of each offense. The jury heard 2 weeks of extraordinary testimony from psychological experts on both sides, from investigators who had processed the apartment, and from family members of victims. On February 15, 1992, after 5 hours of deliberation, the jury rejected the insanity defense and found Dahmer legally sane at the time of each of the 15 homicides. The verdict required the agreement of 10 of 12 jurors on each count, and on every count the threshold was met. 2 days later, on February 17, 1992, Judge Graham convened the sentencing hearing. Family members of the victims addressed the court, each carrying the particular texture of grief that belonged to their specific loss. The sister of one victim, Errol Lindsay, called out to Dahmer in the courtroom with a raw fury that required the bailiff's intervention. Another family member asked the court whether Dahmer had ever stopped to think that each of his victims was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. Dahmer himself addressed the court, speaking for several minutes in a low, deliberate voice that observers described as genuinely remorseful in tone. whatever its ultimate authenticity. He said that he had never wanted freedom, that he had wanted death for himself, and that he had known, even while doing what he was doing, that he was sick or evil or both. He said that if he could give his life to bring back the loved ones of those present in the courtroom, he would do it. Judge Graham sentenced Dahmer to 15 consecutive life terms, the maximum available under Wisconsin law, which does not permit the death penalty, for a combined total of 941 years of imprisonment. He was also convicted of the Ohio murder of Stephen Hicks and received an additional life sentence from that jurisdiction. Dahmer was initially held in protective custody at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, isolated from the general prison population due to the severity of the public reaction to his crimes and the genuine concern that other inmates would attempt to harm him. In 1994, he was moved to a different facility and allowed limited contact with other prisoners as part of a phased reintegration program. On November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death in a prison bathroom by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver, who also fatally attacked another prisoner in the same incident. He was 34 years old. The Oxford Apartments building where he had lived and operated for 3 years was demolished in November 1992. The site at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee remains an empty lot, grassed over, with nothing to mark what occurred there. His father Lionel Dahmer later wrote a memoir called A Father's Story, in which he attempted to trace his son's development and to understand what he had missed and what, if anything, he could have done differently. The memoir is striking for its honesty and its essential unanswered question, which is the same question that emerges from every case in which a person led a functional, unremarkable life in the presence of people who loved them while simultaneously doing what Jeffrey Dahmer did. How does a human being contain both of those things at once, and how does the world around them fail so consistently and so completely to see it? Number 8. Robert Lee Yates Jr., the Spokane serial killer. There is a phrase that appears in the accounts of almost everyone who knew Robert Lee Yates Jr. before his arrest in April 2000. He was the last person you would have suspected. It appears in the statements of his neighbors, his co-workers, his fellow National Guard service members, and even, in various forms, in the court testimony that accompanied his sentencing. It is a phrase that has become so familiar in the context of cases like his that it risks losing its meaning through repetition, but in the case of Robert Lee Yates it carries a particular weight, because the gap between who he appeared to be and what he had done across 2.5 decades was not a small gap requiring close examination to identify. It was the gap between a decorated military veteran and father of 5 who attended church and worked steady jobs and was known in his community as a reliable, honorable man, and a person who had been causing the deaths of women in and around Spokane, Washington since 1975, whose victims numbered at least 16, and who had at one point buried a body in his own front yard while his family lived in the house. Robert Lee Yates Jr. was born on May 27, 1952, in Oak Harbor, Washington, into a family that provided a conventional and stable upbringing by all available accounts. He showed no particular academic distinction but was described as a responsible and disciplined young man, and after completing high school he enlisted in the United States Army, where he trained as a helicopter pilot. He proved himself capable in this demanding and technical role and served multiple tours of duty, including assignments in Germany and Somalia, accumulating a record that earned him the designation of decorated veteran. His military service gave him a skill set and a professional identity that commanded respect in any community, particularly in eastern Washington, where military service carries significant social currency and where men who have piloted military aircraft are understood to have demonstrated qualities of courage, discipline, and reliability that translate directly into civilian credibility. When Yates left active duty and returned to civilian life in the Spokane area, he built a life that matched the impression his military background had created. He married. He and his wife had 5 children, a family large enough that its daily logistics, school schedules, sports activities, meals, finances, constituted a full and visible domestic life that was itself a kind of alibi, the perpetual, low-level evidence of a man whose time and attention were accounted for. He worked a succession of jobs that kept him embedded in legitimate institutional structures. A stint as a correctional officer at a state prison facility, work at an aluminum processing plant, and various positions that placed him in organized, regulated environments where his conduct was observable. He was also an active member of the Washington Army National Guard, serving as a helicopter pilot, and continuing to accumulate military credentials that reinforced his public identity as a man of duty and service. Neighbors in the various Spokane area neighborhoods where the Yates family lived over the years described him consistently as friendly, helpful, and entirely unremarkable in the best sense of the word. Not boring, but stable. The kind of neighbor who waves from the driveway and helps with the garbage cans and whose presence on the street feels like a contribution rather than a liability. His first known act of fatal harm against another person occurred in 1975, when he was 23 years old and still in the early stages of his military career. The 1975 victims were a young man and woman in southern Washington whose cases went unconnected to Yates for 25 years. In 1988, a woman in northeastern Washington was similarly targeted. Then, between 1996 and 1998, a period during which Yates was in his mid-40s, an established member of his community, a father of 5, a National Guardsman, the pace of his crimes accelerated dramatically. Over those 2 years, at least 13 women in and around Spokane were targeted. Most of them were women working in street-level prostitution along the commercial corridors of the city, a target selection that, as Gary Ridgway had understood in Seattle a decade earlier, reduced the speed with which their disappearances registered as connected and urgent with law enforcement. Spokane authorities established a task force to investigate the pattern of disappearances and deaths, and that task force gathered information and followed leads and generated a substantial investigative record over a period of years without arriving at a name. Yates, during this period, had been stopped and questioned as part of a canvassing effort focused on men who drove white vehicles. Witnesses had noted that some victims had been seen entering a white car. Yates drove a white Corvette. He was stopped, his name was taken, and he was released. A field report generated during this encounter was subsequently misread by investigators who believed they were looking for a white Camaro rather than a white Corvette. Yates drove away from that encounter and continued for years. The critical break in the investigation came not through a witness or a behavioral pattern but through physical evidence. In April 2000, investigators examining the case of Jennifer Joseph, a victim whose disappearance was among those attributed to the Spokane killer, obtained a search warrant for Yates's white Corvette. Inside the vehicle, they found biological evidence linking Yates to Jennifer Joseph's death. Subsequent DNA analysis connected him to 12 additional victims. Investigators searching the property at his home made a discovery of particular horror. The remains of one victim, Melody Murfin, had been buried in the front yard of the family home while the Yates family was living there. His wife and 5 children had gone about their daily lives. Meals at the table, homework at the kitchen counter, children playing in the yard, with no knowledge of what was beneath the lawn. Yates was arrested on April 18, 2000. When his wife learned the full scope of what her husband had done, she described the experience in terms that echoed those of the spouses of every other man in this account. She had seen nothing, suspected nothing, and the person described in the charges bore no relationship to the man she believed she had married and built a life with. Yates was charged in Spokane County with 13 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. He entered a guilty plea to these charges as part of a negotiated agreement that removed the death penalty from the Spokane proceedings, on the understanding that he would cooperate with investigators and acknowledge the full scope of his crimes. At his sentencing hearing in October 2000, family members of his victims filled the courtroom. Chris Oliver, whose brother Patrick had been among the 1975 victims, asked Yates directly whether he had any concept of what it meant to spend 25 years going to a cemetery as a substitute for a family reunion. Yates apologized to the families and said that he prayed that God would right the wrongs he had committed. Spokane County Superior Court Judge Richard Schroeder sentenced Yates to 408 years in prison, a term that will keep him incarcerated for many lifetimes over without the possibility of release. The proceedings in Spokane, however, did not resolve everything. Yates was separately charged in Pierce County, in western Washington, with 2 additional murders, those of Melinda Mercer and Connie Ellis, for which the Spokane plea agreement provided no protection. He was tried on those charges, convicted, and sentenced to death. The Washington State Supreme Court upheld the death sentence after reviewing his appeals, and an execution date was set for September 2008. That execution was stayed due to additional appeal filings, and Washington State subsequently imposed a broader moratorium on executions that remains in place as of 2026. Robert Lee Yates Jr., now 73 years old, remains at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, his death sentence effectively suspended, but his freedom permanently foreclosed. The military veteran, the father of 5, the National Guard helicopter pilot who had served his country and attended church and been described by his neighbors as the last person anyone would have suspected, will die in that facility. The families of his 16 or more confirmed victims, many of them still in the Spokane area, many of them still living with the particular grief that accompanies losing someone whose death went unacknowledged for years because the circumstances of her life made her disappearance easy to ignore, continue to carry that weight long after the man responsible was taken into custody and placed behind bars. Number 9. Dean Corll, the Candy Man. In the Heights neighborhood of Houston, Texas, in the early 1970s, there was a man who gave away free candy. He was known to the children of the neighborhood by name, and they knew him as a generous and friendly figure. The man from the candy factory, always smiling, always willing to hand something out from the supply he seemed to have in perpetual abundance. Parents in the neighborhood knew him as well. His family had operated the Houston Heights Candy Company for years, and he was, in the context of the community, a familiar and benign presence, the kind of locally rooted figure whose family history in the area conferred a kind of informal trustworthiness. He worked as an electrician for Houston Lighting and Power Company, a steady and respectable job in the city's utility infrastructure. He was unmarried, in his early 30s, and he was known to be particularly generous with the young people of the neighborhood, buying them beer when they came around, offering them money for small tasks, hosting them at his apartment with the easy hospitality of a man who simply enjoyed the company of young people and had the resources to express that enjoyment in tangible ways. His name was Dean Arnold Corll, and between 1970 and 1973, he was responsible for what investigators would later establish as among the most extensive series of crimes against children and young men in the recorded history of the United States. Dean Arnold Corll was born on December 24, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, the first child of Arnold and Mary Corll. His parents divorced when he was young, and his childhood was shaped by the instability of that separation. His mother remarried multiple times, and the family relocated frequently, eventually settling in Houston, Texas. By the time Dean reached adolescence, he was living in Houston Heights, and the family had established a candy manufacturing business, the Houston Heights Candy Company, which became the commercial anchor of his public identity for the rest of his life. He served in the United States Army from 1964 to 1965, a period of military service unremarkable enough that it generated no notable record, and returned to Houston to help run the family candy business. He was by all external accounts a cooperative and hardworking presence in the enterprise, known in the neighborhood for the candy giveaways that earned him his nickname and for a generosity with children that the adults around him interpreted as a warm and avuncular temperament. The candy company was eventually sold, and Corll took employment as an electrician, maintaining his roots in the Heights community and his established reputation within it. He was known to befriend teenage boys in the neighborhood, offering them work, money, beer, and the general social currency of an adult who treated young people as equals rather than subordinates. In 1970, he began acting on impulses that had, by his own later account provided through his accomplices after his death, been building for years. Corll did not operate entirely alone. He recruited 2 teenage boys from the neighborhood, David Owen Brooks, who was approximately 14 years old when he first became involved, and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., who was approximately 15, to assist him in identifying and bringing other young men to his various residences around the Houston and Pasadena area. The arrangement Corll offered Brooks and Henley was financial. He paid them for each person they brought to him. Brooks and Henley, both from difficult home circumstances, accepted the arrangement without initially understanding the full nature of what they were facilitating, and by the time the full picture became apparent to them, they were so deeply enmeshed in what had occurred that their own sense of self-preservation kept them participating. What Corll had constructed inside his various residences was a specific physical apparatus, a plywood board fitted with restraints that investigators later called the torture board, to which victims were secured after being incapacitated. His victims were boys and young men between the ages of 13 and 20, predominantly from the Heights neighborhood and the surrounding areas, many of them from families already dealing with instability and poverty, whose disappearances were reported to Houston police over a period of 3 years and who were, in a pattern grimly familiar from other cases of this period, not pursued with the urgency that the scale of their vanishing warranted. Parents who reported their sons missing to the Houston Police Department were in many cases told that their children had likely run away, a determination made quickly and without thorough investigation, and one that allowed the pattern to continue undisturbed. The community of the Heights was a tight one, and the disappearances accumulated a visible grief. Families who had simply stopped hearing from their sons, who had filed reports and received no meaningful follow-up, who carried the particular anguish of uncertainty that is, by most accounts of those who have experienced it, among the most difficult forms of grief to sustain. Over the 3-year period from 1970 to 1973, Coral and his 2 accomplices were responsible for the deaths of at least 28 young men and boys. Victims were taken to various addresses that Coral maintained or rented in the Houston and Pasadena area, and their remains were subsequently transported and buried in locations across a wide geographic range. A boat storage shed he rented in southwest Houston, wooded areas, and beaches along the Texas Gulf Coast. The boat storage shed became the primary repository and contained the majority of the remains that investigators would later recover. The system that Coral had constructed, the community reputation, the generosity with young people, the 2 teenage accomplices who moved through the same social world as his victims, was brought to an end not by law enforcement investigation but by one of the accomplices themselves. On August 8, 1973, Elmer Wayne Henley brought 2 friends to Coral's house in Pasadena, a young woman named Rhonda Williams and a young man named Tim Curley. Coral was furious that Henley had brought a young woman, as she did not fit the pattern of his targeting, and he turned his anger on Henley as well, telling him that he would become a victim alongside the others. Henley, who later told investigators that he had been afraid of Coral for some time and had discussed with Brooks the possibility that they might themselves become targets, found himself in a moment where he believed he had to choose between his own survival and continued compliance. He talked Coral into releasing him from restraints, telling Coral that he would participate in whatever Coral intended with the others. Once free, Henley retrieved a pistol from the area of the room, pointed it at Coral, and told him that he could not continue. Coral told him to go ahead and shoot. Henley fired 6 times. Dean Arnold Coral died of gunshot wounds in his own home on August 8, 1973. He was 33 years old. Henley called the police himself. When officers arrived at the house in Pasadena, they found the body of Coral, the 2 friends Henley had brought, and the physical apparatus of what had occurred in that house and its predecessors. Henley and Brooks, in the days that followed, led Houston police to the various burial sites. The boat shed in southwest Houston yielded 17 sets of remains buried beneath a layer of lime plaster. Additional remains were found in the wooded areas and along the Gulf Coast locations that Coral's accomplices directed investigators to. In total, investigators recovered the remains of 27 young men and boys, a number that established what was then the largest confirmed body count of any serial criminal case in American history. Questions were subsequently raised, and have never been entirely resolved, about whether the full number of victims may have been higher. Henley himself, in later interviews, has suggested that the actual count exceeded what was officially confirmed, and at least one victim, known only as the swimsuit boy, remains unidentified as of 2026. Dean Coral himself faced no trial, having died at Henley's hand. His 2 accomplices were prosecuted separately. Elmer Wayne Henley was tried and convicted of 6 counts of murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive terms of 99 years each in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He has been denied parole at multiple hearings and has been the subject of ongoing discussions about possible compassionate release in recent years, requests that the families of victims have consistently and passionately opposed. David Owen Brooks was convicted of 1 count of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in a Galveston hospital in November 2020 from complications related to COVID-19, having served 45 years of his life sentence. The Houston Police Department faced significant criticism in the aftermath of the case's discovery for its failure to adequately investigate the missing persons reports filed by the families of Coral's victims over the preceding 3 years. Critics argued that the demographics of the victims, young boys from working-class and lower-income families in a neighborhood without significant political influence, had shaped the urgency with which those reports were pursued, and that a more thorough investigative response to the earliest disappearances might have shortened the period during which Coral operated. The Candy Man of Houston Heights, the smiling man with the free sweets and the welcoming apartment and the reputation as a friend to the young people of the neighborhood, left behind 28 families whose grief was compounded by years of official indifference. The community of Houston Heights, which had trusted him precisely because he had made himself trustworthy through years of visible generosity, was left to reckon with the fact that the person who had seemed most present and most benign in their neighborhood had been operating, within that same neighborhood and in those same years of apparent generosity, in a way that produced the largest crime of its kind in the recorded history of the country at that time. Number 10. Lonnie David Franklin Jr., the Grim Sleeper. There are cases in the history of serial crime investigation in which the gap between the public face and the private conduct of the person responsible is so extreme, and the duration over which that gap was maintained so prolonged, that the case becomes, beyond its specific criminal content, a document of institutional and social failure as much as individual pathology. The case of Lonnie David Franklin Jr., the man investigators eventually identified as the Grim Sleeper, is one such case. Franklin operated within a single community in South Los Angeles for more than 2 decades, targeting women from that community, and was not identified until 2010, not through the investigative methods that had failed to find him across 25 years of active investigation, but through a form of forensic technology so new that it had never previously been used to solve a murder case in California. He was 60 years old at the time of his arrest. He had spent nearly half of his life committing crimes against his own neighbors, and those neighbors had spent those same years attending his cookouts, admiring his cars, and knowing him as one of the familiar, reliable figures of the block. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was born on August 30, 1952, in Los Angeles, California, and grew up in the South Los Angeles neighborhood, where he would spend the entirety of his adult life. He completed high school, served briefly in the United States Army, and returned to his neighborhood in the mid-1970s to build the domestic and professional life that would define his public identity for the next 4 decades. He worked for the city of Los Angeles as a garage attendant in the sanitation department, a municipal job with the stability and benefits of public sector employment, a position he held for years. He married a woman named Sylvia, and the couple lived with their children in a house on West 81st Street in South Los Angeles. The same house where Franklin had grown up, a fact that underscored the depth of his roots in the community and the completeness of his integration into its social fabric. He was known throughout the neighborhood as a person who loved cars, collecting and restoring them with a dedication that gave his home a particular identity on the block. He was known as a man who threw generous backyard barbecues, feeding neighbors and community members with the casual hospitality of someone for whom the social pleasures of communal life were genuine and important. He was known by name to virtually everyone on his street and in the surrounding blocks. He was, by the most straightforward measure of community presence, a fixture, someone whose presence was so well established and so long-standing that it had become part of the texture of the neighborhood itself. Between 1985 and 2007, a series of women were found deceased in alleys, dumpsters, and vacant lots across South Los Angeles. The victims were predominantly black women, many of them involved in street-level sex work or struggling with addiction, whose deaths were reported and investigated but whose cases accumulated into an unsolved pattern that the Los Angeles Police Department did not publicly acknowledge as connected for a significant period of time. A community activist and journalist named Christine Pelisek was among the first to draw sustained public attention to the pattern, writing a series of investigative articles that examined the connections between the cases and raised questions about the institutional response to a series of crimes whose victims had not received the investigative resources that cases with different victim demographics routinely generated. It was Pelisek who coined the term Grim Sleeper in reference to the apparent 14-year gap in the pattern between 1988 and 2002, a dormant period during which no new cases were attributed to the same perpetrator, before new cases began appearing. Franklin was going to his municipal job during all of those years. He was throwing his barbecues. He was working on his cars. He was attending community events and maintaining the social relationships of a man firmly embedded in the life of his neighborhood. He was also, as investigators would eventually establish, photographing his victims. A collection of photographs found in his possession after his arrest depicted dozens of women in circumstances that suggested unconsciousness, raising questions about the full scope of his conduct that the confirmed case count may not have fully captured. The investigation that ultimately identified Franklin was built around DNA evidence recovered from multiple crime scenes that had been preserved across the years without producing a match in the standard forensic databases. In 2008, California enacted legislation that permitted law enforcement to conduct what is known as a familial DNA search, a process in which DNA from a crime scene is compared not only against the profiles of known offenders but against partial matches that might indicate a close biological relative of the unknown contributor. In 2008, a familial search of the California DNA database produced a partial match to a profile submitted in connection with a separate minor criminal matter. The partial match was consistent with the profile of a close male relative of the contributor, specifically a father or brother. The person who had submitted the profile in connection with the minor matter was a young man named Christopher Franklin. Christopher Franklin was Lonnie Franklin's son. Investigators moved carefully from that point, collecting additional biological material from Lonnie Franklin without his knowledge, from a slice of pizza he left behind at a restaurant he frequented, from items he discarded. The DNA in that material was compared to the crime scene profile. The match was conclusive. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was identified as the source of the DNA found at multiple grim sleeper crime scenes. On July 7, 2010, investigators arrested Franklin at his home on West 81st Street. He was in his yard when officers arrived. Neighbors who witnessed the arrest described their shock in terms that were entirely genuine. This was a man they had known for decades, whose cookouts they had attended, whose children they had watched grow up, and the idea that he was the person the police were taking away in handcuffs for crimes they had been reading about in the news for years was, by their account, simply not something their minds could accommodate immediately. A search of Franklin's home produced evidence of extraordinary scope. Investigators recovered hundreds of photographs depicting women in circumstances consistent with the pattern of his crimes. They found jewelry and personal effects that were later connected to specific victims. The physical evidence within the house provided investigators with material that informed the case against him and raised serious questions about whether the number of his confirmed victims represented the full extent of his conduct. Franklin was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. His trial, delayed by a series of procedural matters and the complexity of the evidentiary record, did not begin until 2016. The prosecution presented a case built on DNA evidence, testimony from a survivor, and the physical evidence recovered from his home. Franklin's defense challenged the forensic evidence and raised questions about the reliability of the familial DNA identification process, a still emerging technology whose legal and scientific status continued to be debated in California courts. On May 5, 2016, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all 10 counts of first-degree murder and the single count of attempted murder. The deliberations had lasted approximately 8 days. Franklin showed no visible reaction to the verdict as it was read. The sentencing hearing took place in August 2016. Family members of the victims addressed the court and the man who had targeted their daughters, sisters, and mothers while maintaining the appearance of a respected and neighborly presence in the same community where those women had lived and died. Judge Kathleen Kennedy sentenced Lonnie David Franklin Jr. to death. He was sent to death row at San Quentin State Prison. On March 28, 2020, Franklin died in prison of natural causes. He was 67 years old. His death came before the appeals process had been exhausted, before any execution date had been set, and before the families of his victims had received anything approaching a comprehensive accounting of what he had done and why. California's moratorium on executions, enacted under Governor Gavin Newsom in 2019, meant that even without his death from natural causes, Franklin would likely not have faced execution in the near term. The questions that the grim sleeper case left behind are not only questions about Lonnie Franklin. They are questions about the systems that surrounded him, the investigative resources that were and were not applied to a pattern of crimes against women in South Los Angeles over 25 years, the community within which he operated with complete impunity for more than 2 decades, and the families of his confirmed victims who spent those decades without answers about what had happened to the women they loved. The 10 women whose deaths were confirmed in his convictions: Deborah Jackson, Henrietta Wright, Barbara Ware, Bernita Sparks, Mary Lowe, Lacrica Jefferson, Alicia Alexander, Princess Bertha Muir, Valerie McCorvey, and Janisha Peters, were each, as the prosecution emphasized throughout the trial, a complete person with a name and a history and people who loved them and they deserved the full weight of investigative attention that should have been brought to bear on the circumstances of their deaths far earlier than it was. The man who took their lives was their neighbor. He was at the barbecue. He was on the block. He was, to anyone who encountered him across 30 years of community life in South Los Angeles, exactly who he appeared to be, until the day he was not.